Disney is an old company by American standards, with it celebrating its 100th birthday in 2023. And with the new year, it will begin it with a new old CEO, Bob Iger. While the news cycle is currently filled with stories of erratic CEOs, polyamorous scammers who were in way over their heads, and an android who wants people to live in a virtual world, we'll get back to it in the next video. I wanted to take a break from all that to talk about a more peaceful transition of corporate power, at least publicly. This video is about the tale of two Bobs, both accomplished in their own rights, and why one of them prevailed over the other. Bob Chapek may have only been CEO of Disney for 2.5 years, but that's not where his career at Disney began, which was back in 1993 as the marketing director for the Buena Vista Home Entertainment division. At the time, the division was focused on selling VHS tapes. I'm glad technology has moved on from those. Anyway, it turns out that Mr. Chapek was glad too, being recognized by former CEO Michael Eisner for wanting to adapt the business with the times. He was always an executive that you knew would be on the rise. He knew how to grow the business while adjusting to the changing marketplace, which was intense. Chapek is credited for bringing Disney's home entertainment division into the digital age by focusing on releasing properties on DVD and later Blu-ray discs. In 2006, he was promoted to become the president of Buena Vista Home Entertainment. In 2009, he became president of distribution for Walt Disney Studios. In the early 2010s, Chapek is also credited with integrating Star Wars and Marvel merchandise into Disney's core licensing program, as his responsibilities changed, with him having been elevated to president of Disney Consumer Products in September of 2011. In 2015, just 4 years later, he became the chairman of Parks and Resorts, aka Disney World, which saw him being in charge of investing tens of billions of dollars into the properties Disney is known for. With continued success in his new role, he eventually led the Consumer Products division and Parks and Resorts at the same time. Huge responsibility, and with this new responsibility came the spotlight of potentially taking over someday as the CEO of the Walt Disney Corporation. In other words, Bob Chapek had an accomplished and successful career at Disney up to this point. He would eventually be promoted to CEO in February 2020, replacing the other Bob whom we're going to talk about now. Depending on how you look at it, Bob Iger either started at Disney 2 years after Chapek or 19 years earlier. You see, his Disney tale begins in 1974 when he first joined ABC, which at the time was an independent company. Seems so long ago now. Starting from the bottom, Iger did menial labor on television sets for what's a little over $900 a week in today's dollars, or $150 in 1974 dollars. He would then spend the next 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder at ABC, culminating in becoming president and chief operating officer in 1994. In 1995, Disney acquired ABC. This is when Bob Chapek was handling VHS tapes, making this the beginning of Iger being Disney. He'd spend the next 4 years as chairman over ABC, after which Michael Eisner promoted him to president of Walt Disney International in February of 1999. This would be a short-lived position, as just under a year later, in January of 2000, he'd get promoted again to president and chief operating officer, which was seen as being the number 2 position within the conglomerate. Iger, who has been Disney's international head, is the first real number 2 exec in the company since Frank Wells died in a plane crash in 1994. Michael Ovitz, brought in sometime later, never achieved Wells' status within the company during a short-lived reign that ended with a large cash settlement from Disney in 1996. Bob Iger at this point already had quite the successful journey as a career man in the Magic Kingdom, but after a feud between Roy Disney and then CEO Michael Eisner, the latter eventually found himself ousted and Disney was in need of a new leader. Iger was made CEO in 2005. Animation has always been at the heart and soul of the Walt Disney Company, and it is wonderful to see Bob Iger and the company embrace that heritage by bringing the outstanding animation talent of the Pixar team back into the fold. This clearly solidifies the Walt Disney Company's position as the dominant leader in motion picture animation, and we applaud and support Bob Iger's vision. This happened within 6 months of Iger's Iger's ascent to the top. In 2006, Bob Chapek was still busy with Buena Vista, but as Iger grew the Walt Disney Company into the media conglomerate it is today, Chapek was essentially put in charge of integrating all the new acquisitions into the existing merchandising and theme park businesses. This is not the easiest thing to do, as the acquisitions made by Bob Iger were all powerhouses in their own right. The aforementioned Pixar, then Lucasfilm, and then of course Marvel. It's clear that the two Bobs have had a lot of cooperation over the years, if only by necessity. Around his birthday at the very nice age of 69, Bob Iger decided to retire, and the board named Bob Chapek as CEO on February 25 of 2020. A mere 2 or 3 weeks later, the United States would then go into a semi-shutdown over the COVID-19 pandemic. In my own experience, it's always best to try and leave things in a better state than you found them in, because you never know how long you'll be responsible for making sure things still work, or whether you'll ever have to come back to it again. 2.5 years after his departure, a well-rested Bob Iger, I can only assume, was announced as the replacement for Bob Chapek, who wasn't informed of the rotation until the night before Iger was slated to make his return to the Magic Kingdom. It is at this point where we have to ask ourselves the obvious questions. Why did Chapek get fired, and why did Iger come back? No matter your opinion of the guy, the timing of Chapek's promotion to CEO is probably one of the most unlucky ones you can imagine. This is a guy who, after 27 years at Disney, finally gets to the top, only to have the world flipped on its head with a pandemic. And with that pandemic, the company turned to Chapek, the man whose career was partially built on his expertise running the parks and resorts, to figure out how long the parks would have to close for, when they'd reopen, what kind of sanitary and hygiene precautions would have to be implemented. In other words, the financials during his tenure as CEO were always doomed to be challenging to nurse back to health, and I think the board of directors had to have understood this to some degree, given that Chapek lasted 2.5 years as CEO, not 2.5 weeks or months. No, I think most people's speculation will align with my own. Disney, despite what they may or may not be up to behind the scenes, is a company that cares about its image a lot. And when you care about your image, you want to portray yourself as being as inclusive as possible. But before we get to this final part of the story, don't forget to hit the like button if you're having a good time, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. In February of 2022, Florida passed the Parental Rights in Education Act, aka the Don't Say Gay bill, and reports came out that the bill was sponsored by legislators who received donations from Disney. A Disney led by Bob Chapek, a Disney that cares about its image. As we have seen time and again, corporate statements do very little to change outcomes or minds. Instead, they are often weaponized by one side or another to further divide and inflame. Simply put, they can be counterproductive and undermine more effective ways to achieve change. Not really standing up against a bill that's openly discriminatory, eh, Bob? If he was at the top of some obscure financial or pharmaceutical company, it would be quite reasonable to send out a dry, corporate-y, neutral communication like that. But this is Disney we're talking about. And Disney is a family-friendly, inclusive company that welcomes everybody to the Magic Kingdom. When President Joe Biden tweeted this, "I want every member of the LGBTQI+ community, especially the kids who will be impacted by this hateful bill, to know that you are loved and accepted just as you are. I have your back, and my administration will continue to fight for the protections and safety you deserve." Bob Iger, who publicly leans left, replied with the following: "I'm with the president on this. If passed, this bill will put vulnerable young LGBTQ people in jeopardy. It doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with Joe and Bob. When it comes to shining in the court of public reputation, it is always the wiser choice to be seen as being guided by love and compassion, not hate and repression." So let's briefly put ourselves in the shoes of the board of directors at Disney. Our financials are looking bad because of the pandemic, and our CEO is fumbling about when it comes to publicly standing up for human rights. Meanwhile, our ex-CEO, who's made us billions of dollars, is still representing the values we want to be associated with. Many people become successful by making bold decisions that result in overall positive outcomes. Sometimes these decisions are based on skill, other times they are based based on gut instinct. But even overall good moves can have unpleasant side effects. A year before the Don't Say Gay incident, Chapek was involved in another fumble, but this time with Black Widow herself, Scarlett Johansson. The Black Widow movie was supposed to become the first MCU film to be released exclusively in theaters after the pandemic, and it is assumed that Johansson's contract included some part of the ticket sales. Chapek's mistake was in releasing the movie on Disney Plus simultaneously without getting her buy-in. This triggered a lawsuit over the missing revenue that was being cannibalized by Disney Plus. Bob Iger would never make such a blunder. During those tense months when Spider-Man was almost out of the MCU as talks between Sony and Disney fell apart, star Tom Holland made his case to Iger directly. If Iger had been in charge of Black Widow's release, he would have involved Johansson at every step and effectively sold her on the plan. Chapek knows how to make good money-making decisions. Iger knows how to lead a company. We will probably never know the exact words made on the phone calls to either of the Bobs, how they got Iger to come back, what justification they used to oust Chapek. We can only speculate on information we have. Two individuals with storied histories at the Walt Disney Companies with two different outcomes. We don't know whether Chapek was struggling to reconcile personal feelings with his public statements, or if he was attempting to be dry enough to appease both sides. We know he didn't toe the publicity line, and he didn't have the financial performance, intentional or otherwise, to get this misstep wiped under the rug. We also know that Chapek made big decisions without informing key players. Bob Iger agreed to return for a period of 2 years, with his top priorities being finding a new successor and creating a long-term strategy for the company to follow once he retires again. I know this story portrays Bob Iger as the hero in some way, or even as a father figure for the company, but that's intentional framing to help convey how the board at Disney might be viewing things. A quick glance at Bob Iger's Wikipedia page will reveal that he's not without his own share of allegations, but they're all about his inactions as CEO against other people committing actual crimes. Is this excusable? Probably not if there's any truth to them. But from a legal and PR perspective, Bob Iger has, unlike his successor, former successor Bob Chapek, curated enough distance and plausible deniability from the incidents people tried to connect to him. Instead, he is seen as a CEO with incredible vision and a great track record without having sacrificed his humanity. Given this contrast between the two Bobs, it makes sense why they'd bring back the one they know can set a direction for the company for many years to come. Thank you for watching.